What's up, everybody? This is the Strange Land Podcast. My name is Kenny. I'm one of your co-hosts, and I'm here with my good friend Stefan. How you doing tonight?
I am doing awesome, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. We took a week off just to sort of, relax. We've been doing it every week now for a few months, so we'll try not to miss a week very often anymore.
Yeah, it was a nice little break that we got, and now we're ready to get back at it.
Most definitely. And real quick before we begin, I just want everyone who's listening, if you don't mind, sending us an email, just sort of talking about what we want or what you guys think. And we'll try to reply whenever we can. Our email is thestrangelandpodcast@gmail.com. And if you guys would do that, we'd much appreciate it.
Yeah, let us know. Our sort of format can be changed pretty easily. So if you guys have any ideas on, I don't know,
just any type of feedback, critical feedback, we would appreciate it very much.
Yeah.
So we've covered BTK, and we've covered Rich Ramirez, and we've covered H.H. Holmes. And Gary Ridgway makes every single one of them look pleasant to deal with. I mean, sure, Rich Ramirez was a complete and total psychopath, and they were all horrible, but Gary was killing at a rate that is really hard to imagine. And when I say pleasant to deal with, I mean, he just killed so many people. Richard Ramirez was probably like the devil in a human body, I mean, he was absolutely insane. He was ruthless, and the way that Richard Ramirez acted in court was just beyond evil.
It was flashy and showy, too,
Yeah. And the way that Gary Ridgway acted in court was a lot more, he was very calm and quiet, and
it's weird to say, but reasonable almost. He was more reasonable in court.
And, I think I want to discuss that a little later, like why he was like that.
Right.
But in 3 months, in the late of 1982, 6 bodies were found. And in 1983, 9 bodies were found. And in the course of a year and a half, 15 bodies were found. And in the course of 2.5 years, 28 bodies were found. Just in the 80s alone, 40 bodies would turn up and be directly linked to Gary. But there were way more, at least double. And unlike H.H. Holmes, this speculation is more likely the truth. When I say that because, like, H.H. Holmes, everyone thought, like, we covered him 3 episodes ago, and the rumors were H.H. Holmes killed hundreds of people, and he more than likely only killed like 6 or something.
Some people say 1,000.
1,000, yeah. No, it was probably more like a handful. But Gary Ridgway really did kill upwards of 100 people. And Gary killed so many women that when he was in court, he admitted to losing count. The fact that someone could become so desensitized to murder and have that much lack of a conscience and caring for other human beings is the reason that I was drawn to this case. A lot of people, I don't know how you feel about this, Stefan, but a lot of people think that this case is kind of boring. If you go online and read people's comments, a lot of them talk about kind of how boring it is, and I think that's because Gary was kind of a boring guy.
Definitely.
Kind of like BTK, except I think that BTK, I don't know.
Well, I think like a lot of, just like Gary Ridgway, but I think with other serial killers, they're a little bit more fantasized than Gary Ridgway.
Yeah,
like
that's
you're
true.
right. He's a really boring dude. He wasn't like Son of Sam, who had this dog demon who was talking to him, telling him to do killings. He was, a killer nonetheless, but it wasn't as fantastic as some of the other serial killers.
Exactly, and the point that I think is so amazing about this case is just not amazing, but terrible, is how many people he's killed. And how someone could lose count of the amount of people that they are murdering and disposing of in modern day USA. It's just insane. He killed so many people that a few bodies that were found are still unidentified to this day. They don't know who they are. They just, he was able to go back and locate them, or, he helped them locate them at one point. So they know that he did kill these people, whoever they were, but they don't even know who they were because he doesn't remember their faces or their names, of course, or anything. He doesn't know who they are. So Gary Leon Ridgway, he was the second-born child of Mary and Thomas. He was born on February 18th, 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah. And at a young age, Gary and his family would move to Seattle, Washington, and this is where he would spend his childhood and grow up. Gary's childhood was deemed to be somewhat troubling, and he specifically had a very troublesome relationship with his mother. He had a defense psychologist during his trial, and he said that he had he told the defense psychologist that he had mixed feelings about his mother, and he would go back and forth between feeling very angry towards her and feeling very sexually attracted to her. And of course, for a young child, this is extremely confusing. Not knowing exactly how you feel about your own mother, going back and forth from wanting to engage in sexual acts with her and murdering her. Gary would confess that he wanted to know what it was like to kill his mother, and it seems like he often fantasized about it.
Yeah, so that's pretty weird. I actually saw a documentary the other day about brother and sister sort of like incestual relationships. I fell down a rabbit hole on YouTube, but it seemed in a lot of those cases where you had like a sexual attraction between direct family members, they were separated for a long time, and they always wanted to find their sibling, and when they did, they realized they had this weird sort of sexual attraction for him. Now, in this case, that's obviously not the case. He grew up with his mom and dad, but it leads me to wonder, like, what specifically would be the cause of the sexual attraction.
Yeah, I mean, that you could say a lot about just the psychology of that.
Right.
What exactly made him think this way. And it's pretty interesting to think about the point that you made a second ago about brothers and sisters who get separated and then they find each other later in life becoming sexually attracted to each other. I'm not a trained psychologist or therapist or anything like that, but it seems like there's something sort of, as far as like the brother and sister thing, how that goes, it seems like it's something you sort of just feel connected with this person,
right?
And it's very easy to feel sexually attracted to someone that you didn't spend your childhood with or you didn't grow up with,
right?
As far as Gary goes with his mother, I mean, we'll get we'll get into that in a second,
right?
How she treated him. But I think that how she treated him had a lot to do, obviously, with his murderous fantasies about her. But I think it also probably had something to do with the sexual fantasies as well.
Totally. I can see him being mad at her for him having these fantasies. You know what I mean?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, maybe.
It's wild speculation for sure, but it's interesting to think about. It's an interesting dynamic for sure.
Definitely.
So the problems at home began to manifest themselves in school. This is something that is quite common in children who have a troubling home life, and he really struggled with schoolwork as well. He had his IQ tested and it showed a score of 82, which is quite a bit lower than the average person, which is about 100? Gary Ridgway was never seen as a complete loner or loser at school, and even had friends and was well liked all around. When Gary was 16 years old, he would attempt his first murder. Gary took a 6-year-old boy into the woods and stabbed him through his ribs. He walked away right after stabbing the boy, laughing. He said, "I always wanted to know what it was like to kill someone." Gary had obviously manifested serious thoughts of killing people from an early age, and some of this may have come from the early relationship he had with his mother. Something else that we didn't say before was that Gary had a big problem with wetting the bed, much later than most other children, which is, totally typical in serial killers. Not all serial killers do it, but
only in 12 episodes. We had our first episode, another Gary, right?
Right.
Gary Heidnik. Yeah, he wet his bed, and his dad, Gary Heidnick's dad, of course, hung the sheets out for everyone to see.
Yeah, he let the whole world know.
Yeah, but it looks like his mother would do the same thing. He, scold and humiliate him every time he did it. So it's like, yeah, this seems to be sort of a reoccurrence in certain people with these kind of traits,
Yeah, definitely. He would even wet the bed up until 13 years old. And like you said, his mother would scold him and humiliate him every time he did it. So this humiliation may have fueled some of the perverse thoughts he had about his mother, and maybe it even, clouded his mind. After Gary graduated, he wedded his high school sweetheart, Claudia Craig. At that point, he enrolled in the Navy and was deployed to Vietnam, where it was claimed he saw battle. While he was in the Navy, he began having sexual experiences while in ports with prostitutes consistently, and eventually contracted gonorrhea. He rebuked the prostitutes for contaminating him, which began a lifelong hatred for them. And it also added fuel to the fire for his hatred for women in general. At the point when Gary Ridgway came back to the U.S., he found that Claudia had been having an illicit relationship, and this would end up in a divorce. In 1972, Ridgway went back to Seattle, where he had grown up, after being dishonorably discharged from the Navy.
Yeah, so this is kind of a weird thing too. It's like he can't control his desires to want to be with prostitutes, and maybe this has something to do with some type of sex addiction or something.
Sure.
I mean, he's wanting this, he's paying for it, he's going out and doing it, but at the same time, he doesn't like them. He doesn't like the fact that prostitutes are wandering around, and I think I'll cover this a little bit later. It was, prostitutes would be in the area that he lived in at a certain point, and
Sure.
he didn't like the fact that he would see prostitutes everywhere, but at night he would go and pay them for
As
sex,
most sailors did.
right? So, it's kind of a weird conundrum that he's found himself in.
And you'll see this throughout the case. This is sort of a common factor. I mean, we won't get too much into it, but this guy targeted prostitutes.
Yeah.
Most of his victims were, ladies of the night. But I think this is truly where his disgust came in for prostitutes, basically.
So he would get a job at a local plant, and it was painting designs on like semi trucks for Kenworth, and Kenworth is an 18-wheeler truck manufacturer. And he quickly found another spouse. Her name was Messia Winslow, and he would often have sex with Messia in public outdoor areas in Western Washington. And this was kind of early in the marriage, and it's crazy because the same places that he would have outdoor sex, which is definitely a fantasy of his, these places would later become dumping sites of the bodies for many of his murders. And they had a kid together named Matthew. And he didn't seem like he was particularly happy with the birth of Matthew. It changed their marriage. It made things a lot different, mainly because she had to take care of this child, So he was someone that wanted, when he wanted sex, he had to have it. And because of this child, she had to take care of Matthew. And so this sort of put a hindrance on his sexual desires. She wasn't just available to him whenever he wanted her. So his demeanor, began to change with her, and he wanted to start choking her. And this was something that he, eventually started really liking. He wanted to start choking out his wife, and she eventually divorced him. And during this time, he'd become very religious, and he went door to door. He was reading the Bible aloud to people at, people door to door. He would read the Bible aloud to people at work. And he even tried to make his family follow the teachings of their pastor. And even as religious as he had become, he would still go and have sex with prostitutes. And, his ex-wives and his multiple girlfriends said that Gary had a very strong sexual appetite, and supposedly it could not be controlled. It was said that, like I said before, when he demanded sex, he would get it no matter what. And, like we talked about earlier, Gary would have quite a disdain for prostitutes. And like I said, he had this love-hate relationship with them. He would complain to people, his neighbors, people at work, about the amount of prostitutes that he was seeing in his neighborhood. And just out in the open. But then, again, like at night, he would go and he would, have sex with them, pay them for sex. And he would go to see them regularly. And I'm sure that it really was a inner moral battle with himself. At one hand, he's very, very religious. And on the other hand, he has these uncontrollable desires for sex and prostitutes. And now at this point he's not getting sex from his wife as often because of Matthew. So I'm sure that he finds even more reasons and time to go out and find prostitutes.
Right, it's pretty much his only option at that point to control his desire.
Exactly. And like you said earlier, a lot of his victims were prostitutes. So at some point, I don't know if it was the hatred for prostitutes or if it was just out of ease.
Mm-hmm.
He switched that from having sex with them to having sex with them and killing them.
Right.
And it sort of just progressed into this thing where he was like, you know what? I'm just going to start killing prostitutes.
And then having sex with them.
Yeah, that's true.
So Gary Ridgway is said to have killed, like we said earlier, upwards of about 71 women around the Seattle and Tacoma area of Washington. While Gary was in court, he stated that he had killed so many women that he actually lost count. The murders went throughout the 80s and 90s, but most of these murders happened within a 2-year period between 1982 and 84. Basically, all of his victims were either prostitutes who we already know he had a liking for, or they were runaways that he would just pick up as hitchhikers, people walking down the Pacific Highway South. Gary would kill all of his victims by strangulation. This makes it seem like his intent was to have a very personal connection with the women he was killing. We know shooting someone in the head with a gun, like Richard Ramirez, isn't very personal. Stabbing someone, and especially strangling them, however, is very personal and up close. This probably allowed him to enjoy the experience as much as possible, and like BTK, it would allow for the victims to suffer more, which would get him off.
And the thing is we talked earlier about his desires to choke out his wife while they were having sex. And so that obviously shows that he has some type of fetish for that, which isn't that big of a deal. Usually a lot of people like to be
pretty
choked.
common.
Yeah, it's pretty common. But, I feel like this is the reason why he chose strangulation as the method of killing his victims. Because obviously he got more out of strangulation than he would even stabbing. You said that stabbing is very personal, and it is, and it's like strangulation is even more personal. And because of the fact that he probably has a fetish for this sort of thing, he's getting a lot out of this.
Right.
Yeah.
Just amplified everything more.
Exactly.
Gary would mostly dump the bodies of his victims in wooded areas that were along or around the Green River, which is of course how he got his name. After he would kill the women, when he was getting ready to dump them, he would strip the victims naked, and then would sometimes pose them in positions and make them look seductive, at least to him. The bodies were also discovered in clusters, where many of the bodies would be found together, which goes to show how many women he was actually killing, and how often he was doing so. This shows how many women he would actually go on to kill. I mean, this guy was burying clusters of bodies. He had so many bodies, he didn't know what to do with them. He had to bury them together in the same graves, essentially.
Exactly. Yeah, he had clusters of bodies. I mean, he has such a huge body count. It's insane. It's like when you look at BTK, he killed 10 people.
Right.
Richard Ramirez, am I wrong? But didn't he killed 13,
Mm-hmm.
didn't he? So it's like, this guy killed, and we said 71. The thing is they found 71 bodies, right? I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
He was convicted of 49, but we know he killed 71. Honestly, I could be wrong about that. I'm pretty sure that we found 71 bodies. The thing is but he says that he killed up to 90, to close to 100.
Right.
And it's like, we kind of have to take his word on that. But I think it's a word that it's okay to take because he has kind of proven that he was killing, groups of women and dumping groups of women off. And so, his body count was ridiculous.
Yeah, the evidence sort of speaks for itself when, we'll talk about it later, obviously, but they found these graves just stacked full of bodies, and it's hard to believe that those were the only ones.
Oh yeah, there are definitely some out there. I think we can say pretty well enough that there are probably bodies out there that have never been found. We know there are. We know there's at least probably 20 or something, which is
right.
I don't know. sad, but that's why we're talking about it.
Right.
So everything really began on July 15th, 1982. And two children were spotted a body floating along the Green River underneath a bridge. Her name was Wendy Lee Caulfield, and she had disappeared on July 8th. Again, this is July 15th, so it's about 7 days after she disappeared.
About a week.
Exactly, the body was seen floating. So she was 16 years old, and she had been a runaway that Gary had picked up along the side of the highway. And, we said a lot of them were prostitutes.
Right.
A lot of them were also runaways, And you had a lot of people, especially I feel like, I don't know how many people hitchhike nowadays. It's like, you don't really have to hitchhike anymore. I mean, I'm sure people still do for sure if you're homeless or if you're just a drifter trying to go across America or whatever.
Sure.
But I feel like in the 70s and 80s, man, people were hitchhiking all the time.
Oh, dude, especially in Seattle, man.
Yeah, that's true, too. I didn't think about that. For sure. So 4 weeks after that, on August 12th, the body of Deborah Lynn Bonner was found, again floating up the Green River. And only 3 days later, a man in his boat on the river came across three bodies that were laying on the river bank. The three ladies' names were Marcia Faye Chapman, Cynthia Jean Hides. Do you say Jean or John?
Yeah, I would say, it's Jean.
Okay. And Opal Charmaine Mills. 1 month later, the body of Gazelle Ann Lavorne was found along the river as well. So in the course of 3 months, they found 6 bodies along or in the Green River. So Gary was killing extremely fast. And again, they found 3 bodies all at the same time, all together. And that means he killed them so quickly, back to back to back, that he was able to drop them all off alongside the river. And think about it, like he's not killing all 3 of these women at the same time.
Right.
I mean, we heard that he did keep some bodies, so maybe he would, and he had a truck, so maybe he would take all of them out at the same time. But it could also have been the fact that he would kill someone, drop them off, kill someone, drop them off, kill someone, drop them off. But I think really what he would do is if he had 3 bodies he wanted to drop off, they would be somewhere in his on his property, and then he would take them all at the same time.
Right.
Yeah. So while all this was happening, like I said before, he was working at Kenworth, putting the paint designs on trucks. The plant he was working at was not very far away from where he was dumping the bodies. If you watch interviews with coworkers at the plant, you'll find that Gary was extremely meticulous about how he designed trucks. He would want to make them perfect. His coworkers would also note how he would look at women, and he would become dazed while looking at them, almost like he was in a trance or something. The meticulousness while designing trucks could be the key to discovering how he was able to kill so many women in such short periods of time. He definitely took advantage of the area that he was at, because they were right on the Green River. There were tons of wooded areas around the Green River and around the plant that he worked at. And this is where a lot of the bodies were found, in hills and, just right along the river. And, it's funny because, I feel like everyone sort of knows someone like that. I don't know. I don't know if I know someone like that with the whole women thing.
Right.
I don't know if I know someone that bad, but you sort of always meet someone who's really like that.
Oh, dude, agreed. I was going to say, over the time I've been alive, I've definitely known a few guys to look at women like that, and you almost look at them, and you're just like, "Are you serious right now?"
Yeah,
you can
definitely
see it in their face.
Yeah, no. In one of the interviews that some TV show or something, I can't remember who did this. They interviewed one of his coworkers on camera, and he was like, "Well, most men sort of look at women like, oh, okay, someone's passing. That's
Sure."
But he would really look and become dazed and in a trance, and that's sort of where we got that. Is he would say that Gary was just obsessed with women.
Yeah, and that's what I was gonna say. I really think that this goes to show how compulsive and obsessive he really was. Whether it was painting trucks or women or murdering, he would just be. He would obsess over these things, is what I'm trying to say, and it occupied all of his mind,
Most definitely.
So after the first 5 killings, the information was given to the public, and there was a community outcry to find the culprit behind these crimes. They were able to put together that this was done by a single killer, but there was very little evidence. With that being said, they have no motive, no suspect, and virtually nothing to go off of. A task force is quickly formed by the police department, and they open up an investigation.
A tip line, basically.
Yeah, right, where hundreds of people can call in and give their information.
And like what we've said about tip, I think we talked about tip lines with the episode DC Snipers.
Right.
Tip lines can be like great, and they can be devastating to a case.
Sure.
And especially in the DC Snipers episode, like I just said, dude.
Ton of false information being reported. The actual killers calling themselves, and
exactly.
The call getting lost.
Yeah, definitely.
So no tips that led anywhere really came in from this. But the task force leader, Dave Riker, met a taxi driver named Melvin Foster. Melvin was an ex-con who would drive a taxi cab through the streets, usually working the graveyard shift. He was someone who would pick up girls in his taxi and give them rides to places, sometimes for free. He would also give them money, food, shelter, if they needed it. Like everyone else in the area, Melvin learned of the Green River killings and realized that he knew quite a bit of these girls who had gone missing.
Okay, real quick, did you saw the interviews with Melvin, right?
No, I actually didn't.
Well, there was one documentary where he was in, and I'm telling you, this guy is so creepy. I don't want to say that about him because he seemed okay. He seemed like he really helped with the investigation. I don't know about help, but he cooperated very well. But man, this guy comes on camera and he is kind of creepy. I'm just saying. He's the way he talks is real weird, and I was like, man, when I didn't know that much about the case, I was like, whoa.
Melvin called into the police station because he knew of another taxi driver who he had believed was the Green River killer. The more he kept talking about this to police, the more police began to expect Melvin himself. They began to question exactly why he had been so interested in these women, and it's quite common for the killer in these cases to call in and try and help with the investigation. They brought him down to the station and questioned him, and then they put him on close watch. They put him on 24-hour surveillance and would get search warrants to basically check out his house and his taxi. And the police did just that. They went through everything in his life, watched him all the time, and had cop cars stationed outside of his house, all day. Melvin was completely open to this because he said he had nothing to hide. Of course, with all of this being said, he would eventually be released from being a suspect completely. This is probably because bodies continue to pile up while police are surveilling his household.
Yeah, so I mean, he's being watched 24 hours a day, and bodies are still turning up. And like you said about him saying, he had nothing to hide. If you watch interviews with him, he was like, yeah, come watch me all the time, go through whatever you want. I don't care because I have nothing to hide and I'm not the killer. So do whatever you need to do.
Right. He called their bluff, essentially.
Oh, for sure. And yeah, bodies kept turning up. So Melvin was released, or not released, but
cleared.
Yeah, cleared. So after all this, everyone starts to believe that this may have been someone who just came into town. They killed a few prostitutes and then left town, maybe coming back and doing it again and whatever. And this is why after Melvin is released as a suspect, bodies stop showing up. It's kind of weird, actually. Bodies didn't really show up for a while after that, so everyone thinks that maybe the person just left town.
Right.
And what I believe is Gary began to think a bit harder about where he dropped the bodies off and the circumstances, surrounding how he dropped them off. He of course had been watching the news and following the investigation just like most serial killers do, and he would begin to attempt to do things that might throw off the investigation just a little bit. He would leave wrappers from gum and other types of snacks, that sort of thing, cigarette boxes, and even written stuff on papers belonging to other people. And again, this is just to try to fool the investigators just a little bit. They would find the body of Linda Jane Rule on January 31st, 1983. A few months later, on May 8th, 1983, they found the body of Carol Ann Christensen. Carol was found by a family who was hunting mushrooms about 30 miles away from Seattle in the foothills of the Cascades. So Carol's body was found face up with a paper sack put over her head, and her hands were folded over a bottle of wine. And put on top of her folded hands was ground up sausage, which had been molded into the shape of a pyramid. And sitting on top of Carol's shoulder and throat are two trout. Like the fish, two trout were sitting on top of her shoulder and her throat. And it's hard to say what this means exactly. I don't think it really means anything. The body wasn't found floating along a river like most of the other bodies, but it had been found quite a bit away, just sitting in the foothills. It's believed that Gary chose this spot because he believed that it was remote enough that no one would find the body, and that he could come back to the body whenever he wanted and do whatever he wanted to it. And we would find out later, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, that he performed sexual acts with decaying bodies. So this is something that he wanted to do. He fantasized about it. He would go and he would perform sexual acts on a decomposing body.
Yeah, I don't even know where to go with this, man. Sausage, trout.
Yeah, this body doesn't make any sense. I think he was just trying to throw everyone off. Like to say, okay, this is some other person, obviously. But, he wasn't that smart, and I think he kind of went over the top. If maybe he had just left a bag over her head and maybe something else that's small, but the beef and the trout, it's like...
So strange.
Yeah, what are you
Into
doing?
a pyramid.
Into a pyramid?
It's sort of ritualistic, I get it, but... I could see, I guess, how that would play into his fantasy, especially because he liked to pose the bodies, but still, it's just odd.
Yeah, it's super odd. I think he was just trying to throw them off, and I don't think he did a very good job because he just went a little bit too far.
Right. When Carol's body had been found, it had only been the third body to show up in the past 8 months. And because of the unusual circumstances behind the find, the investigators weren't 100% sure if it was connected to the Green River killings, like Kenny said. However, the bodies would begin to start to show up again in the fall and winter of 1983. Before this point, the investigation team had gotten so used to only looking at the Green River for the bodies, they had stopped showing up. The task force was disassembled in an attempt to reform with new ideas that could help catch the killer. Task force leader Dave Riker stopped by the office of Bob Keppel, who was one of the nation's leading criminal investigators. Keppel brought fresh ideas and was able to show where the task force holes had been. Between August 11th, 1983 and December 15th, they found 7 new bodies and were able to figure out about 23 women who were still missing, most of which who were prostitutes or were runaways that went missing from nearby highways. So therefore they assumed that at some point these missing women were from the same killer. Throughout the year of 1984, 14 new bodies would surface. The investigation team set up a second task force, again with Dave Riker at the helm, and with much help from Bob Keppel and another criminal investigator named Dave Reichart. Together, Keppel and Reichart would greatly help the investigation team in attempting to figure out who exactly was behind the killings. Keppel and Reichart would end up going and interviewing serial killer Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy had heard of the case and he believed he could actually offer some help. On a side note, Ted was due to be killed, and he is known to have tried many things in an attempt basically to delay his death. Bundy came up with a theory during the interviews, and he told investigators that the best shot they had to catching the killer red-handed was to stake out the area along the Green River where the bodies had been left recently. So Bundy believed that the killer might come back to the corpse in an attempt to perform some sort of sexual acts on the body, which makes sense, honestly. It's a great idea.
Yeah, it's something that I'm sure Ted would have wanted to do.
Yeah, it's
Right.
it's great inside information. Ted Bundy. It's sort of a weird cameo Ted Bundy has in this case.
Yeah, Ted. The interviews between the investigators and Ted are online. You can look at YouTube and find them and see what exactly was said. And this is something that I think Ted only really did for one thing. Like you said, he wanted to try to help to delay his
Sure.
execution, but also he sort of felt like, for one thing, he was probably really bored. And I feel like this is sort of a control thing from Ted Bundy's standpoint. He was like, he wanted to be part of this, and I don't think he gave a shit about helping out anybody.
Oh, dude, no way.
Yeah, he just wanted to be part of something. And I don't know if it was control, but it was more of he'd been out of the spotlight. Like Ted Bundy had now been out of the spotlight for a while, and he was just attention, he needed it.
I also think he was probably some part of him was living vicariously through Gary Ridgway, and he
for
knew
sure.
exactly his motives and like where he was going with this. It was all very familiar to him.
And, as we know, Ted Bundy would end up being correct about this in the end. Gary Ridgway did, in fact, go back and perform sexual acts on the bodies. However, Gary was so far ahead of the investigation team, by the time that they found the bodies, they were completely skeletonized. What the investigation team wanted to do was stake out one body and wait for Gary to come back. But they could never find, and the investigator, Dave Riker, says this on video, they could never find bodies in time. By the time they found bodies, there was nothing left except for the bones. So there was no chance of them finding that.
It also makes it hard to identify them as well, like who these actual people were. Like we were saying earlier, We don't
Exactly.
even know who these people are.
Exactly. And so, yeah, they could never find a body that was fresh enough to test that. And at this point in the investigation, there were actually upwards of 50 investigators working on the case. And, one thing that we haven't mentioned is that Gary had actually been a suspect in the case. In 1983, Gary had been arrested for solicitation of prostitution. In 1984, they gave him a polygraph test, and he passed it. The first breakthrough came from two investigators, Randy Mullinex and Matt Haney. The two of them together would endlessly go through old documents and files that they had gathered on the Green River killings. And as the two of them dug deeper, they started to find connections between quite a few of the victims and a man named Gary Leon Ridgway. The first woman to be linked to Gary was named Marie Malvar. Marie was working as a prostitute on a corner by a hotel, and Marie's boyfriend was in a car across the street watching to make sure everything went well. He saw Marie get into a truck and decided to follow them to make sure everything was, going according to plan. He noticed Marie get into a fight with the person inside, and the truck took off. The boyfriend tried to follow the truck but could not keep up. And after 3 days of her not showing up at home, the boyfriend went to Marie's father's house and told him about this. Marie's father, her brother, and the boyfriend went house to house looking for the truck or any signs of evidence of her. And eventually they found the truck, parked at Gary's house, of course. And the police came out and questioned Gary, but they were never able to link any other evidence to him.
It's pretty crazy that they did a polygraph and he passed it. This goes to show, we hear now that polygraphs are pretty unreliable, and if you're trained correctly, you can pass them every time, but...
and that's why they're not allowed to be used in court.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it is sort of crazy that he was able to, again, keep his calm, cool, collective state about him and be able to pass the polygraph test.
I think it's really crazy that they went door to door looking for the truck and found it.
Yeah.
Yeah, they just went door to door in this neighborhood,
Right, and that was sort of reminiscent of BTK as well, right? They had a car that they were looking for, and they just happened to stumble upon it, and it actually led somewhere this time.
Yeah, exactly.
So in November of 1983, Kim Nelson would disappear, just like the others. Kim was 21 years old at the time. Gary picked up Kim while she was working as a prostitute, and he would use a similar story that he had used in the past. Another sex worker named Paige Miley saw the truck that Kim had gotten into and was able to give a decent description of the man. They did a sketch composite done based on her description of the man, and when they put it next to Gary's face, it looked exactly like him. They put together a lineup of men. They showed Paige all of them, and she had picked Gary Ridgway almost immediately. Things are starting to line up with Gary looking like he's the main suspect, and in April of 1987, they were able to get a search warrant of Gary's house and take body fluid samples from him. They take hundreds of items from Gary's house and try to link them to any of the murders, but they come up with nothing. Nothing eventually, they can't get any of this evidence to stick to Gary specifically.
Yeah, and this is in 87, so this is in the middle of the 80s, and it's not like it is today with, DNA wasn't where it was, fingerprints, they weren't where it is today. Now we can do just crazy stuff in laboratories with DNA and testing and that sort of thing. And, back then it just wasn't like that.
And it's crazy, too, when you say back then. I mean, it was 87. What year were you born?
90.
So I was born in 91. So just to think of how far we've come. I mean, we talk about this like it was forever ago, but it was,
Yeah, it was just not that long.
Just a couple of years ago,
not
really.
Even 30 years.
In the sands of time.
About 30 years, I mean.
Right. After they fail to make an arrest, the task force again has its funding cut. By 1990, only one detective is working on the case, down from about 50 in 1983, which is huge. I mean, that their workforce has been cut by 50 times, essentially.
Exactly. One person now.
So Dave Riker was the only person who was on the task force at this time, and he got promoted to sheriff of the police force, which means that he had abandoned the case essentially with everyone else. After this, things quiet down for a while. In 1988, Gary married his third wife, Judith Mawson, and after they got married, his kill rate almost dropped completely. Out of his 49 confirmed killings, only 3 deaths occurred after Gary married Mawson. When he was interviewed by police about this, he said he truly loved Mawson and that he was happy with her. He says that this prevented him from killing other women, and Mawson seemed to think the same thing. She says that she thinks that she helped save lives because they had a happy marriage, which is a really twisted way to look at it, but it is sort of true. It's just objectively true. He was busy with her, meaning he couldn't go out and kill prostitutes or whoever he could find.
Yeah, and if we look, like we look in the past, he wasn't really happy with any of his marriages. And this sort of leaned to him to go to prostitutes. And that, led to him killing the prostitutes.
Right.
And so, yeah, when we say that he killed people in the 80s and 90s, but I believe he only killed 3, maybe 4 people that we know of in the 90s. And so, yeah, it was mostly in the 80s, and most of them were done, when he was unhappily married or when he was single. And so, yeah, I mean, who knows if, I guess we have no other reason to believe it's not true. But.
Right. Why do you think that is? Even a serial killer, after he finds love, then his craving for killing goes down.
I mean, this may be something to do with the sexual satisfaction. I don't know if Mawson the third wife, ever went on any interviews and said that they were doing some freaky shit, but maybe they were doing some stuff that he was sexually satisfied with.
Fair enough.
And therefore, he didn't have to go to prostitutes and he didn't have to do all this stuff. And part of the big reason that he went out and did all of this was because he wasn't satisfied.
Right.
I guess that's part of it.
Oh, yeah, I agree totally.
Yeah, and so whenever he becomes more satisfied, he has less of a reason to go out and kill. I don't know if that's how everyone is. I just feel like that might be how Gary is.
Right. In
So,
his case, that's probably what happened.
exactly. So, 19 years after the first bodies were found, the case had gone cold, and only a couple more bodies had been found. The task force was basically non existent, and something was going to happen if a break in this case was going to be made. So, Dave Riker is, like we just said, he's still the King County Sheriff, but he has not forgotten about the infamous Green River Killer. And he was there during the very beginnings, and he believes the case could still be solved. Remember, Dave Riker has been there since, the very first bodies were found. He was there the first day, and he was signed up as the task force leader at the very beginning. He's been through all of it. Now he's a sheriff. And so he wants to start working on it again. And so at the Washington State Crime Lab, which is in Seattle, Mev Himmick works as a DNA analyst. And she is given permission from Dave Riker to rework the Green River case. And this was in the summer of 2001. So like I said, 19 years. A ton of time has passed since I think the last body was found in 98 before he was arrested. So it's been a few years since a body was found, and it's been a long time since many bodies were found. So it's just kind of been sitting there. And so they still have semen samples from 4 of the crime scenes, or at least, I believe 4 of the crime scenes. And they still have samples from things that were taken from his house. And so Mev works on the case, and for the first time is able to get something out of the DNA and create a genetic profile for the killer. The profile matches very closely to Gary, and the detectives put him right at the top of their suspect list. Right back on the top of their suspect list,
Right.
really, because he was already on there. They had the Melvin guy who was a suspect. I'm sure they had other suspects, but Gary was always at the top of that list, pretty much. So the detectives start following him around, and they see that he still works at the Kenworth paint factory, and they see that he is attempting to look for new women to hunt and kill. And the thing is he was arrested for prostitution in '83. Mm-hmm. He was also arrested for prostitution in 2001 and let go. So in the middle of all of this, happening, and they basically reopened the case and really started to dig into the case again, he was arrested for prostitution. So they know that he's still out there going to prostitutes.
Right, which just goes to show maybe his sexual appetite wasn't really satisfied by his new wife either. It lasts for a while until that feeling dies off, and then those compulsions come right back to him.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree. And so they believe he's out looking for women to kill. And so they decide that the right thing to do is to go ahead and arrest him before he has time to kill again. 2 detectives go to the Kenworth factory and wait for Gary to get off. And once he gets off, they meet him as he's walking towards his car. They explain that he's arrested for 4 murders that are linked to the Green River case. And he basically responds with oh, okay.
Oh, okay.
He actually doesn't give any type of argument. He doesn't give anything. He just says, oh, okay, and he goes along with them.
Right.
It's absolutely insane how nonchalant that is. It's so crazy.
Oh, yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Let's do this.
And so the 4 murders that he's originally charged with are for Marcia Chapman, Opa Mills, Cynthia Hines, and Carol Ann Christensen, all of whom we spoke about earlier in the episode. And of course, it would come out that he murdered many, many more.
So now investigators are put on the task of figuring out how to prove the first 4 murders, as well as trying to prove, all of the other ones that are on their hands. When the task force and the forensic investigators start to look closely at all the evidence, they see that many of the clothes from the victims in this case have tiny specks of paint all over them. They were able to figure out that the paint was a rare type of paint called DuPont Emron, and this paint was not the type of paint that you could just go into Walmart and buy or anything like that. This type of paint is mostly used by factories who paint on vehicles. This is also the exact type of paint Gary uses at his work at the Kenworth factory. The new paint evidence, along with DNA evidence that the criminal analysis was able to put together, links Gary directly with 7 of the murders. The lawyers that are assigned to help Gary with this case at this point don't even believe that they can get him off, and they even buy into the fact that he did this.
Yeah, and the thing with the paint is paint gets all over you.
Right.
Like whenever you're out, especially with automobiles, there's something that whenever you paint automobiles, you wear a lot of, you're supposed to wear like a lot of equipment, but you could just paint in regular work clothes.
Sure.
That you wear all the time that have paint all over them.
Right.
And all it took was Gary to go off and kill someone or drop a body off while he was still wearing his work clothes.
Right. And paint is always in the air, especially when you're painting like cars or anything like that. Oversprays constantly in the air.
Yeah, that's why
everywhere.
Yeah, that's why it's done in an environment that it's done in. I watched some videos of them painting cars and trucks and stuff, and it's like you just watch the paint just wasps through the air.
Yep.
So it's going to land on him, and some got onto the clothes of his victims. And so that's a really interesting way that someone was brought down by paint.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's great.
So his lawyers sit down with him and explain that if he goes to trial, he's definitely going to be found guilty, and they will seek essentially the death penalty. They talk with Gary, and they all agree that he should seek a plea deal. The deal that Gary's lawyers offer to the state is if Gary can avoid the death penalty, Gary will lead police to more dump sites, and this will give them and the families closure on the cases. The state originally did not want to go along with this, but they decided to take the plea deal so that maybe the families could get any sort of bit of closure. So in June of 2003, they signed the plea deal. Gary pleads guilty to 48 counts of murder. Insane, man.
Yeah, and if you listen to the prosecutors in this case, they really didn't want to make this deal.
Right.
I think the lead prosecutor was, he said basically if anyone deserved the death penalty, it was Gary Ridgway.
Totally.
He said like, no, there's no way we're gonna take this deal because he deserves to die.
Right.
And then I guess after sitting down and thinking about it and sort of going over it, and they decided that to find the bodies for the families was worth it.
I think they were smart to do that because taking the route of we do not negotiate with terrorists doesn't seem like it's conducive to finding these or naming the bodies and finding these bodies. You know?
Exactly.
So they were smart to do that.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I see why they did it, and this is one of those things where when we talk about the death penalty, I'm so weird. I'm like, okay, if they want to be put to death, don't put them to death. Because some killers and some people who are on death row they want to die. Like
right.
Like what's his name? Like Jeffrey Dahmer, that's his name. Who he wanted to die, and he wasn't on death row because of I think the area that he was at the time didn't have the death penalty.
Right.
Of course, he was killed in prison, but just by another prisoner. But he didn't. He wanted to die, so it's like, well, throw him somewhere and lock him up, whatever. And Gary didn't want to die, so I see how I can't imagine being a family member of someone that someone like Gary killed. So it's hard to say what exactly I would want, but he doesn't want to die so bad, and he really deserves to die. It's sort of like just kill him, but he's still alive to this day.
Yeah,
like BTK.
I'm right there with you. Like, I sort of flip-flop on the death penalty a lot. Like, sometimes I think they should just sit there and do their time. That's worse than being put to death.
Sometimes. For some people, that's the thing. Not for everyone.
But then again, there is also the monetary argument to it. Like, why even pay for these people to exist?
Well, then and again, yeah, but also you have the fact that the death penalty, like putting someone to death by injection, cost what? How much does it cost?
I have no idea.
$400,000 or something?
No shit.
Some ridiculous number.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly how much it is. I can look it up real quick. But it costs a lot of money to kill someone.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
It's, $200 to kill a dog, but 400,000 to, or put down a dog, I guess I should say.
Yeah, and so this is from California, but the average cost of 11 executions in 27 years was $250 million.
Wow.
So I don't know exactly what that makes up completely.
Right, how it breaks down.
Exactly. It's, like the average annual cost of housing an inmate on the death row is $35,000 a year. So you have that over all these years, and then plus just what everything costs to do everything.
Man.
It's just a ridiculous amount of money.
That seems like a lot of money. I wonder how they get those numbers. I don't even make that in a year.
Yeah, right. I don't know.
Crazy.
That's crazy. But a little off topic. But yeah, I mean, so he escaped the death penalty. And now he's going to, he basically promised that he would lead the police on a hunt to find the bodies, which he does. And, so he goes everywhere and he helps them. They're called field trips.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's literally what they're called, I'm pretty sure, in the prison industry. And they take him in a van and they go through all these areas and they start finding bodies. And they find a lot of bodies, but eventually, they stop finding bodies. And I'm not sure what the exact count of bodies that they found ended up being. But he says, Gary says that, he doesn't remember everything. And once the bodies stop showing up, they stop going on these hunts. But Gary says, that they have probably a good 20 or 30 bodies left that he doesn't know where they're at. So that's a lot of humans, man.
Yeah, it's amazing that one person is able to cause that much destruction by himself.
Yeah, perfect example. Something that someone said online was he killed 80 or 90 people. Like, when you think about it, if he had killed all of these people at one time, it would be this absolutely insane number. It's like someone going in and on some shooting rampage and just killing a bunch of people.
Right.
I mean, he killed all these women separately for the most part, but if he had done it all at once, it's like, man, this would be one of the biggest mass killings of all time in America.
Yeah, exactly.
So he committed a small genocide.
And doesn't he talk about during some of the investigation how he sort of like puts himself as the number one serial killer only because of his body count?
I don't know. I didn't hear that, but I'm sure he does.
Yeah, I listened to an interview and he said that he classifies himself as like the standard, which is
what, that does sound familiar.
It's oddly braggadocious that he would say something like that, but I mean, it's sort of true objectively.
For sure. And the thing is these trips. See, what really sucks about this whole thing, how he escaped the death penalty because he said he would help the families, this is control. He had control of all of these women for many, many years, to the point where he hid the bodies and he's not telling anyone. And the only reason he's going to tell someone is if he doesn't get the death penalty.
Yeah.
This is a complete and total act of control. He has control over everyone because he has the cards. He knows where they've already sentenced him to life in prison. He's not going to die.
Right.
Or he's not going to be put to death. So now he has all the cards. He knows if the bodies are somewhere. He's the only way that they can find the bodies, even relatively quickly. So this is a whole act of controlling the victims and the victims' families and the state and the investigators and everyone, even after he's been caught.
Right.
And that's one fucked up part about this whole plea deal, is it was a whole control thing. I think that's even worse than him not dying.
Yeah,
they basically allowed him to do this.
Right, he's still able to manipulate people, even from prison.
Yeah, and exactly, even from prison. And did you hear about like him using his son? Like he had a picture of his son in his wallet.
Yeah, I did hear this story.
So he would he'd get women to come over to him, and like BTK, he would try to get these women to trust him. So he would show them a picture of his son that he had in his wallet. And I guess that worked for some of them because...
Yeah, I mean, it enforced that he's a family guy and that he, has this...
But yet he's still
a normal person.
But yet he's still out on the streets picking up prostitutes.
Sure.
So,
And, in his defense, not really in his defense, but I mean... Yeah, most of the guys that are getting prostitutes probably have families. Like it's certainly not an uncommon thing.
Oh, for sure. That's how it is with a lot of them.
True.
And did you watch any of the videos from when he was in prison? Or not prison, but from the court videos? Basically, like, what happened was they were in court and he had to say he was guilty to every single count. Every single. So the judge had all these names. The judge had 48 names. This is during the original. There were 49, but one came later. So there were 48 original during the trial.
Right.
And the judge has to read off every single name. Not all together, but he'd read off one name, and then Gary would say guilty. Because he would say, okay, he'd say Opa Mills. How do you plead? And then Gary would have to say guilty. Cynthia Hines, how do you plead? Guilty. Carol Ann Christensen, how do you plead? Guilty. He did this to
And
all
it kept
48.
going and going and going. Yeah, I remember that specifically, seeing that and being like, whoa.
Yeah, and then after that, they gave the families of the victims time to speak. And it actually made him cry. Supposedly, Gary, and he's on video, so it happened, but he cried. And so it's hard to say, like, were those genuine tears?
I side with crocodile tears for sure.
Well, the judge did,
Yeah, no one's seeing through. I mean, that's obvious bullshit. Like, to me, it just seems like, oh, yeah. Oh, I'm so sorry, guys. I killed 100 people. I couldn't help it. It's just like, yeah, well, too fucking late for that. You could have got help at any time, but
Exactly. And yeah, it was during one of the fathers of one of the victims was saying something, and you just see Gary just start crying, and after everything's done and the judge's final statements, he basically just explains how, he didn't believe that those
Right.
tears were real at all.
I don't blame him. I didn't buy it. I mean, I will admit he probably felt bad at the time because he was being punished, but I mean, he didn't feel that bad when he was committing the murders. Obviously, he wasn't losing sleep over it. He was, if he lost sleep, it's only because he was planning more more murders.
Exactly. And like I said, the judge gives, really wise words at the end. And one really weird little fact, the judge, whose name was Richard Jones, he's the brother of Quincy Jones.
Whoa.
Yeah, as weird as that is. Yeah, he was the brother of like a record producer and music composer, Quincy Jones. That's just an interesting little fact.
Yeah.
But yeah, so no one was buying these tears, Yeah, so that's the story of the Green River Killer, Gary Ridgway, and a lot of people call him boring, and I think it's kind of true. If you watch interviews, you watch videos of him, he's really boring. He's just this really boring looking guy, but he killed a lot of women and he ruined a lot of lives. And now he's in prison, sitting, rotting, hopefully, and he's still there. So,
Right.
Yeah.
I think I agree that he was a boring person, but this case is not boring in the least.
No, it was very interesting, and I think everything about it. You have a lot to learn from. How someone can commit such horrendous acts.
Definitely.
So, what are we talking about next week, Stefan?
So next week is gonna be a good one. We're gonna talk about the Papen Sisters. Excuse our American accents. We're gonna butcher that, I'm sure. But the Papen Sisters.
Yeah, I've been reading a lot about them and listening to a lot about them today in the last few days, and I don't know how you pronounce. Is it Papen?
Well, I heard a French guy. This happened in France, and
33.
Yeah, he pronounced it Papon.
Oh, Papa. Okay.
So
yeah, we're definitely gonna butcher the names of. I'm sure we'll get emails about that. Butcher the names of some of the people in this next episode, but
Definitely.
It's a crazy case I hadn't heard of before, and so we're starting to do research on it, and that's going to be out next week. So definitely tune in. Check us out on Facebook, the Strangeland Podcast, on YouTube, the Strangeland Podcast. Our website is strangelandpod.com. And send us emails at the strangelandpodcast@gmail.com. and we would appreciate it.
Yeah, guys, thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Like Kenny said, let us know if you have any questions, or you may have an interesting case you want us to cover.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely that last one. We need more cases. I mean, there are about 1.5 million cases out there, so we just look them up and try to research them and talk about them. But
And we're constantly looking at like 10 cases at a time,
Yeah, for
trying
sure.
to think ahead.
All right, guys, you have a good night.
See ya.